Then, of course, came those golden days.
Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Foucault. Today we are going to look at Discipline and Punish, Part 1, when Foucault talks about torture in the medieval era, and penal practice, and sort of how that sort of structured where we are now. So if you've got your book, Discipline and Punish, I'll be reading select quotes and offering some insight. I'm going to be mostly reading from my notebook because I write a lot of notes, and it helps me to sort of organize Foucault's thoughts into something presentable to other people. So we're going to start on page 29, and I'm going to read this little quote for you. It's a pretty good one. Foucault writes, "The body of the condemned man gives rise to his own ceremonial, and he calls forth a whole theoretical discourse, in order to code the lack of power with which those subjected to punishment are marked. In the darkest region of the political field, the condemned man represents the symmetrical, inverted figure of the king." The lack of power with which those subjected to punishment are marked. Is Foucault saying that those who commit crimes are basically saying "fuck you" to the law, and it's an instance where the law has lost power because someone has defied it. The laws, you can think of law as rules, right? So rules are made up. Rules don't exist. There are no rules. But the law has to pretend that they're true, that they're just, and when they're broken, it's kind of like a mockery of that. You're mocking the system of law that says these rules are true. So, in a sense, the criminal who commits an act of crime becomes his own king. He has determined what the rules should be. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'm going to read you a quote from page 33 and page 34. Foucault writes, "Torture is a technique. Death torture is the art of maintaining life in pain." And on page 34, "An organized ritual for the marking of victims in the expression of the power that punishes, not the expression of a legal system driven to exasperation and, forgetting its principles, losing all restraint." So today we have this view of medieval torture and the legal system back then as atrocious, as inhumane, and it's used to further our prison system, the system of caging people. That's seen as better than putting them on wheels and hitting them with stones. Foucault goes on to write on page 35, "The tortured body is first inscribed in the legal ceremonial that must produce, open for all to see, the truth of the crime." Now Foucault talks about this later, but these days the truth of the crime is determined in court proceedings, which are very public these days. But back in the medieval time, it was all done in secret. The public didn't know anything about the investigation or the sentence right up until the moment of execution. And that was also true for the person being accused. Usually the investigation happened without him around, and he wouldn't even know what he was being accused of until he was being read his sentence and asked to confess. When the body was publicly tortured back in these days, it was a way for people to see the exercise of law that didn't allow them to be part of the investigation. And of course, there were reasons for that, and we'll get into that later when Foucault talks about how we practice law today, and how we punish today, and sort of that relationship between public and private, who gets to know and who doesn't get to know, and what gets to be seen and what doesn't get to be seen. There are these really interesting inversions and reversal of roles that occur throughout history, but there are also these core elements, and one of those is determining the truth of the crime, making it persuasive enough to make the people believe that the punishment is just. Because in order for the people to believe that the punishment was warranted, they had to believe that the crime happened. So now I'm going to read a quote from page 40. To begin with, judicial torture was not a way of obtaining truth at all costs. It was not the unrestrained torture of modern interrogations. It was a regulated practice, obeying a well-defined procedure carefully codified. So Foucault talks about how torture back in the day, it wasn't unrestrained. It wasn't you hit someone until they confessed. There were rules. There was a gradation of pain that accompanied what the accused was being sentenced to or accused of. So, for example, it wasn't that you were either a criminal or not a criminal. It wasn't you were guilty or you were innocent. Back then, if you were being accused of a crime, you were already kind of guilty. So you already kind of deserved some sort of punishment. And so the role of punishment was also to also absolve the criminal, or to purify him in the eyes of both the investigators and the magistrates and the king and the people. Depending on the severity of the crime, determined the kind of punishments that were given. And of course, the rule was, if you didn't confess to what you were being accused of, if you held out through the pain, then you would be basically pardoned. You wouldn't be sentenced. You wouldn't be publicly tortured or executed. And that was kind of like an ace in the hole, or trump card. So it was a problem for the law, and that became more of a problem later. And so, as Foucault is talking about torture in history, explaining that it followed rules and it had regulations and it had purpose, he also, on page 47, writes, an offense offends the rectitude of those who abide by the law. And that quote connects to another quote on page 59, where Foucault writes, the people, drawn to the spectacle intended to terrorize it, could express its rejection of the punitive power and sometimes revolt. The first purpose was to exemplify the law, to show the people consequences of breaking the law, to make them afraid, to make them behave. But the other purpose was to also let the people feel like the law was protecting them, that they were the ones who determined the law, that they were part of that exercise of power in punishing the criminal. An execution that happened in private didn't mean anything. It was useless. The people had to be there. They had to witness it. In watching the execution, they obeyed the law that said this man deserves this punishment. But see, now there was a catch-22 there. If the people felt that the punishment was unjust, the sentence was unjust, or the crime was forgivable, they would revolt. They would free the condemned. And this happened a lot, especially for those who were sentenced for rioting, or for those who committed petty offenses like. So now I'm going to read on page 63, basically the entire page. It kind of brings together this entire section on torture and truth and the condemned man and the public. But above all, and this was why these disadvantages became a political danger, the people never felt closer to those who paid the penalty than in those rituals intended to show the horror of the crime and the invincibility of power. Never did the people feel more threatened, like them, by illegal violence exercised without moderation or restraint. The solidarity of a whole section of the population with those we would call petty offenders, vagrants, false beggars, the indigent poor, pickpockets, receivers, and dealers in stolen goods, was constantly expressed. Resistance to police searches, the pursuit of informers, attacks on the watch or inspectors provide abundant evidence of this. And it was the breaking up of this solidarity that was becoming the aim of penal and police repression. Yet out of the ceremony of the public execution, out of that uncertain festival in which violence was instantaneously reversible, it was this solidarity, much more than the sovereign power, that was likely to emerge with redoubled strength. So what Foucault's arguing here is that in the practice of public execution and torture, and in keeping the investigation private and secret from the public, the exercise of law became a problem because the way that law was being exercised like this, it made too many opportunities for the people to form bonds with the criminals, and it was creating civil unrest, and so the legal system changed, and the way we thought about crime changed. The way crime was glorified in certain areas changed. So back in the day, people would really identify with the petty offenders, because people were extremely poor, and those are the people that came to the scaffold, So basically, if you're attending a public execution, you were watching the death of one of your neighbors, one of your peers, one of the people that you struggled with in poverty, and that was feeding grounds for the people to rise up against power, against the sovereign, and against the law. And so the penal system had to figure out a different way to determine the truth of the crime, other than marking it on the body of the condemned, other than getting the condemned to confess while waiting his execution. The law had to exercise a different kind of method in order for the people to not form bonds of loyalty with those being punished, because of course the law wanted the people to form a bond of loyalty to the law. The law wanted the people to be afraid and wanted them to obey. So one of the things Foucault mentions specifically is this new sort of idea about the criminal. And this is where sort of the idea of the great criminal mind really starts, is right when the law is realizing that in these public executions, the people had the power to decide for themselves whether or not it was unjust, and it had to take that power away from them. So in order to do that, one of the things that happens is they make public the investigation. And we'll get into that in section 2. But another thing that Foucault points to is this whole new genre of crime thrillers. You know, the great battle between investigator and criminal, who is always just one step ahead of them. You know, I mean, we can see this today in you know, the popularity of the Hannibal TV series, you know, or crime novels. You know, I mean, it's everywhere. There's this romanticization and glorification of those who commit the perfect crime, and that has a purpose. I mean, that's wrapped up in the desire for the desire for the law to be justified in condemning petty offenders. So, you know, if you glorify, you know, the mastermind criminal, and you make the people, you know, praise him and glorify him, if you make them idolize him, then those who commit petty offenses, you know, you don't care about them. I mean, why would you care about them? You don't identify with them. You know, you want to identify with the master criminal, you know, who's seductive in a way. So that's kind of section 1. Foucault, you know, kind of glosses over how the public and private parts of the law are kind of shaking out, you know, and how they're going to change over time to continue this, you know, this constant problem, you know, to help solve this constant problem of the people revolting, of the people saying, no, you will not punish our peers, and you will not condemn those who don't deserve to be condemned. But one of the things that really drew people to public execution was the fact that it portrayed in real time what people believed would happen when they died. You know, if you committed crimes against God, you were going to suffer in hell. You know, you were going to be punished for all eternity. So the punishments that the condemned man underwent while his time on earth before, you know, dying, you know, reflected what was going to happen to him later. And the people wanted to be part of that. They wanted to watch it. They wanted to believe in God. They wanted to believe in life. And so that was one of the things that this whole ceremony of death also helped to solidify sort of a Christian-based ideology. The idea that you would suffer for all of eternity. And you know, and that was a really big deal. And so, you know, public execution was something that the people wanted. They wanted to see that. They wanted to see God, you know. And yeah, so that's section 1. It's kind of just a review, but those are basically his basic points. He talks a little bit about truth and crime and that kind of stuff. He's kind of always talking about truth and crime and power in all of his books. So, you know, we'll come back to it again and again, and as we read more, we'll come to understand it more. But yeah, I hope you like this discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. Or thank you for attending Let's Talk Foucault. I hope you enjoyed this sort of introduction, preliminary discussion, and I hope to see you next time.